Right, good evening, everyone. We'll kick off this session now. So just to introduce myself, my name's Barnaby. I am one of the co-founders of Pupil Progress. I am also responsible for largely building a lot of the platform that you see in front of you whenever you use Pupil Progress. And I do a lot of work with schools on their Key Stage 3 tracking, which is what's kind of sparked this webinar and interest around this area. So on the call as well, we have Brett. Brett is our co-founder, is the founder of Pupil Progress, in fact. And it was his brainchild to kind of pull together this whole idea of tracking and assessment online and really simplifying the whole process for teachers. So as I'm running the session, Brett is going to be on the chat and on the Q&A. So if there's any questions that you have at any point, please do just feel free. Also, I mean, it's also one of those things when I'm talking about this, if there is any things that you would like to challenge or to discuss further, then please do put that on the chat and Q&A. It's always great to get feedback as well. And it's always good for us to also challenge ourselves whenever we're looking at these sorts of things. So I'm going to go straight into the presentation, and during the whole presentation you will see the actual platform as well and what we've done for show you various models that we've done with other schools on Key Stage 3. There's three key areas that I'm going to be focusing on as part of this webinar. The first is about how we actually communicate attainment to parents, students, and teachers, and how we can make sure that that understanding of attainment is really clear and consistent across every department, so that we don't kind of get different departments looking like they're outperforming others when actually they're doing an equally good job, which I know can be quite a challenge to solve. The second is demonstrating progress, so how we can actually show very clearly that we are improving our students' progress, and finally about impacting the curriculum. And just so you know, what's kind of gone into informing a lot of this webinar is I've worked with a very large number of schools now on developing bespoke key stage tracking for whole schools, but also at an individual subject level. So whenever we actually work with whole schools, the key thing that we always look to do, and what they also kind of want from us as well, is getting a really consistent approach and language to assessment and measuring progress across all subjects. One that can be adapted to suit each subject area and take in all the needs of the ways that different subject areas assess. Something that provides analysis for individual students, so you can actually pick out your target students that you need to work with, but also you can look at it as a class and a year group, and I'll show you examples of that later. And finally, that we can actually get that data and put it into a student report to communicate with students. So to look at attainment first, I think whenever we have discussions with this, I can guarantee most conversations, it's getting less and less now, but there will always be someone who is nervous about using the idea of levels or grades. And this is fully understandable. And I think basically back in 2015, the DFE put together a report called Assessment Without Levels. This was, I would say, wins a prize for one of the worst named reports ever, because a large number of teachers actually misunderstood that and felt that the new Key Stage 3 needed to not have levels. Whereas whenever they were referring to the word levels, you can see it's got a capital L in their things, and that was because they were referring to Key Stage 3 SATs and Key Stage 2 SATs, where they were giving levels to students. So at the end of year 9, students would sit tests, get a grade or a level 4 to 6 or 4 to 7. And the DFE wanted to remove that to improve the amount of time that teachers had to teach Key Stage 3, so there was less summative assessment, and that they could shift assessment towards being much more formative. Of course, the main thing that came from this was not only that the SATs went, so people then went and reassessed their curriculum, but the key message that was taken was we now need to come up with a way of measuring attainment and progress without levels, and that isn't and was never the intention. The main idea with this was that they wanted to ensure that any new alternative process that was put in place enabled communication between parents and teachers to be really clear. And we were promised models on this, but very few actually came through. So the models that we've kind of come up with here are from our own experience. So myself as a teacher for 12 years and in charge of data and assessment across the school too, and also in working with the large number of schools on their Key Stage 3 tracking. If we follow that on, then the Education Endowment Fund did a study into the effect of assessing progress without levels and some of the key findings from that. And the main thing that they were looking at is not necessarily about taking more assessments. It's about ensuring that the assessments you do actually have meaning. That was the most important thing to ensure when looking at Key Stage 3. And Ofsted has, now made sure and highlighted they don't want schools to be doing it 6 points in a year. They would rather it being 3. And as long as it's formative and useful for your curriculum, then that is the assessment that you should be doing. All assessments, you should have a clear reliability of the assessment. You know what it means, that it has a purpose and will impact on your curriculum, and a value to the students and to the teachers. So as long as you're kind of meeting those key criteria, then we know that we're on the right track. So when we then look at attainment, you tend to be able to group the ways that we group attainment into different types. So some schools go for a 9-to-1 type banding. Others go for a 5, 4, or 3 bands models. And these might vary. So, for this 5-band model, we've got Mastering, Advanced, Securing, Developing, Emerging. That's now commonly being called the mastery approach, not because it's linked to, say, maths mastery or an approach of teaching. It's purely because of the word mastering at the top is just the one that people have kind of latched onto. But I've seen lots of different versions of it. And in the end, it doesn't really matter the words you use so much. It's just recognizing that you have different methods of attainment. And what we actually mean by this is when we look at students who sit any assessment of any type, whether it's done against criteria, marks, levels, or descriptors, you'll have students that will fit into this distribution curve. And we see this at GCSE and A-level and at Key Stage 3. So we'll get this banding of students where majority of them will kind of get around the middle end of marks. And you'll also then have the outliers at either end. Now, this might be this number of marks, this criteria, descriptor, or grade might be the minimum standard that's required to progress on to the next level of the course or curriculum. So, for example, with GCSE, going into A-level, this might be a grade 6, whereas going from Key Stage 3 to Key Stage 4, you might be looking at the options they're taking, and whether they're achieving highly enough for that. So if we split this into 5 bands, then we can name each of those bands how we like. And this is only on attainment. So this is now just marking up where each of the students fall into different groups. The reason why we actually split into bands in the first place, and it's one of those things you might not have really taken the time to consider, is really to actually look at how we can treat each of those groups differently and what we might do in terms of teaching. So the students who are down at the bottom end here, then we know that those are our weaker students in the cohort and they might need a lot more support. Developing, they might need a little bit of an extra support to get up. Securing, they have met the minimum standard we want. They are ready to progress on to the next level, but it's not necessarily particularly strong. Whereas advancing and mastering, we're now getting into the students who are really excelling. So these might be the students where we want to start doing some stretch and challenge to pull them up to advancing and to mastering. The way that we actually split these is entirely up to each school. And of course, there's benefits to split them into more or less bands. When we have less bands, we have slightly larger groups of students, and it's slightly less precise. But then we can go the other direction and go into 9 bands. Now, I know when I'm going to show you this with the 9 GCSE grades, I know there'll be a lot of schools that have flight paths. And I'm going to talk about flight paths soon, because flight paths will look at what grades we would expect at each year. But in this case, I'm just looking at one assessment that we've done this point in time based on the piece of work that we've just done. Based on that piece of work, we might split it up into those 9 strands. So as we get to more bands, one of the things that is worth considering is if we've got students who are grade 4 and students who are grade 5, then if we're splitting them into that level of precision, why are we doing it to that level of precision? Are we actually going to treat the students who are at grade 4 differently to the students who are on a grade 5? If we're not, then you might actually find that it is better just to group those together into one band. So it kind of doesn't matter as how many bands we have, but I just wanted to kind of highlight that as a starting point of the ways that we actually can look at attainment banding. The reason why we want to do that first is because then we can actually move on to progress. So once we know where students are, we can start seeing now whether they've actually made progress between 2 points. Now, there's 2 different approaches about the way this is communicated with parents and with students. The first, and you may not have necessarily used these, and I have also heard these terms both used not necessarily in the right context when actually looking at what's going on. So to explain them a little bit more clearly, age-related grades is where your expected grade stays the same every year. And so a year 7 might be expected to achieve an age-related grade of secure in year 7 and in year 8 and in year 9. And I'll explain how that works in terms of challenge and progression over the key stage 3. And that tends to match any attainment bands where you tend to have 3 to 4, so gold, silver, bronze, or gold, silver, bronze, diamond, as a set of attainment bands. Flight paths tend to be used where every year the grade, expected grade increases. So, for example, if you're doing a year 9, then it might be that when they come in year 7, you expect them to get grade 1, and then in year 8 they get grade 2, and year 9 they get grade 3. And if they carry on in that way, by the time they get to year 11, they're now moving on to grade 4. If we have a look at this in terms of measuring progress, the most useful thing is to actually look at how we can tag it at both ends. And anchor it at each point. So the best way to do that is looking at key stage 2 prior attainment and GCSE. And if we do that, then we actually start making our bands mean something. The reason why I think this is so important is when I've worked in both myself working in schools where we didn't make this necessarily clear, we found that different departments were reading into these different phrases differently. And so they had different measures, and that meant that some departments looked like they had lots of students who were on developing because they thought that their understanding of that was different to, say, another department who were giving lots of students advancing. They were still doing it to the right levels, or the students were still working to the right and expected levels, but just the understanding between each was slightly different. So whenever you look at your attainment, I would highly recommend just making sure everybody is really clear on what this means in terms of progression. So if a student at key stage 2 had lower prior attainment, then you would expect them in a 5-band model to constantly achieve developing in year 7, year 8, year 9, or to be awarded that attainment grade. And if they do that, they are making good progress based on their prior attainment, and that would mean that they will be on track for a grade 3 and above. Now, of course, the student might come in at this level and then start getting securing, in which case that's fantastic. They're making great progress because now they're on track for a grade 5 and above. And what's great about this is the lower attainment and linking it to the GCSE grade shows us and gives us an idea of what our P8s will be like. Because if students are on that same one, then they'll have a P8 of 0, whereas actually if they move up to the higher grades, then they're going to be getting positive P8s. A student who comes in at middle prior attainment, you would expect to be getting securing throughout key stage 3 and then going on to grade 5 at GCSE. So what this means is that when you actually communicate this, or when teachers are communicating about it and checking their assessments, we can now say, well, are the students that are getting securing, are they the students that you would normally expect will go on to get a grade 5 and above? If so, you know your challenge and your grade boundaries for your assessments are about right. If we then have a look at how that level of challenge changes, even though we're using the same descriptors, it looks something like this. So the level of challenge each year, 7, 8, 9, is increasing. So this securing grade, to get that in year 7, you need this level of challenge, but to get that in year 8, we've increased the level of challenge. Now, this doesn't require any change in teaching or what you're doing already. This is something you will naturally do. You can't not teach Key Stage 3 this way. So you'll increase your challenge by doing a larger range of content, just introducing more material, doing that to a higher level of detail. The application of skills to a wider set of contexts and content will gradually increase the challenge. The type of source material that the students might be using. So they might be having to read or interpret source material that's a lot more challenging, has a lot more information. They have to be much cleverer at pulling out the right bits of information and combining complex skills. So as we move through from 7 to 8 to 9, I know certainly for science, I always used to start off when we're doing methods was just write out a simple description. But then as we were going on, then they might need to then pick out the right equipment from, they wouldn't have selected lists. They'd have to come up, be much more building it up right from the start. So you start combining those skills. The other way that we increase the challenge in each of these years is by the assessments that we do and the way we assess and mark those assessments. So increasing the challenge of the actual questions, the material that they might be using. They might have lots more information to pick from. The mark scheme itself will be different with a higher level of depth of answer and specificity of answer. Just thinking about year 7s, asking them a question about what's the difference between a plant and animal cell, I would expect a much less detailed answer than a year 11. So even just by the mark scheme and the expectation of that, we're increasing the challenge. And finally, I think this is one of those things that a lot of teachers, when they're looking at, particularly at the 9 to 1 grade Key Stage 3 system, they can struggle with, is because they kind of go, well, if we go for a year 7 student and they're getting a grade 3, well, they haven't actually done any GCSE material. Whereas when we actually go through from year 7, year 8, and year 9, we are increasing their pool of knowledge. There's a lot more information they can select from. They know much more about your subject. So actually it can be much harder to pick out the right answers because they're kind of aware of a lot more. So when you're using an assessment structure where you've got the same attainment bands in every year, then what we should be aware of is that it might require year-specific, or it will require year-specific learning outcomes and criteria. And the other benefit is the level distribution is likely to match your final intake. And I'll show you that when we come to the analysis towards the end. So here is an example of the criteria. So this one is for PE based on our head, heart, hands model. And where we've got emerging, developing, secure, this is for year 8. As we go up into year 9, we might be doing different topics. We might be doing it with different sports to get us secure. Their level of depth of explanation might be higher. The skills that they need to show to get the securing may be higher too. So your criteria will change as you go through each year. So to actually show you an example of where we've actually built a tracker like this, there's a couple of trackers that we have that are just open for anyone to use to add to their subscription as a Key Stage 3 tracker, which are Pupil Progress Mastery and one for 9 to 1 grades. I'm going to show you with drama to begin with. So when you open up the tracker, it doesn't matter which subject it is, it will look very similar to this. So you'll have an attitude to learning or behavior, effort. You can choose those when you set up your class, where you might just put in a comment about the student's attitude to learning. But you can see at the moment we haven't got anything about the assessment. So to add the assessment, we just go to add end of topic tests and term 1. And this means every subject can assess in exactly the way that they want to. So I'm going to put in an assessment where they did a performance on Grim Tales. And for this one, because it's drama, I'm going to assess it against AO1. And I'm also going to assess it against AO2, which is their actual performance. And I can put the detail of that in there. And I can also put AO1 here. But of course, if this was DT, if it were, you might have make, design, make, evaluate. For maths, you could put in question 1, which is on numeracy, question 2, which is on weights and measures, and again, just the max marks for each of those questions. But you can also link it to those numeracy and algebra topics as well. Then if I come down, I can choose which classes I want to add that to, save the end of topic test. And if I go back to the tracker, then those columns will now be added. So you can see here we've got Grim Tales, AO1 and AO2. And now I can just start entering my marks for that student. And because we've matched this up to the types of level that the students are working at, then you can see that this is now averaging out those scores and giving students a grade based on how they've done in each of the strands. You can see over here as well, we've got a topic summary. Now, this topic summary is specific to drama. So for drama, we've done bases on the GCSE AO strands, because generally when we've worked with a lot of drama departments, that is what they tend to use at Key Stage 3 too. And now we can actually see how we can start building up a picture about the particular skill areas that we'll be reassessing in every term. If I switch across to a version of this where we've now got assessments, you can see I've now put in 3 assessments. This one we've just gone out of 20 marks because we might want to just do an actual written paper. So that might work for other subjects like history or geography as well. And then if we come across to one where we've actually got the full data in, we're now having a look at this in a little bit more detail. So we can see that this one, because this is the average row up here, this paper here was where they were slightly weaker compared to Grim Tales and Big Day Out. So we've had improvement and progress over the class over the term. And if we have a look at the overall grade for the students, we can see we've got their attainment grade, but then we've also got the colour behind to show progress. Now, the way that we're demonstrating progress here for these students and whether they are on track by their own prior attainment is using the colours, because we've got minimum target grades here. Now, this comes back to the descriptors we had here. So if a student came in with lower prior attainment, they would be on track for developing to get a grade 3 and above. So if we look here, this where we got a student who had middle prior attainment in Key Stage 2, they've got a target of securing. This one's got a securing, this one's got advancing because they were higher prior attainment. Now, if you have a look, we've got students who are on track are green, students who are below are yellow, students who are above are blue, and students who are 2 or more grades below are red. So these are the ones who are serious cause for concern. Now, this student, although they've got securing just like these, was one of our gifted and talented, or real high achieving students before. So this is now actually a concern. So we need to target these 2 students. And this is where this data starts becoming really informative, because these are the students that we might now have a conversation with the parents about what it is that's going on and why they're underachieving compared to where they should be. The students who are in yellow are students who are not necessarily going fully under, but are slipping and will be a negative progress rate by the time they came to Key Stage 4. So let's intervene early on in Year 7. Let's start working on them now. So we can start picking out our key students to work with. And because all of these students who are yellow are securing, we also know their attainment level and therefore what level of work we should be doing with them to try and pull them up, and that we should be trying to shift them up to advancing. If we have a look here as well, we've also got our topic summary where we can start seeing across the group, where is it that I might want to adapt my curriculum in the next few lessons. So AO1, 2 and 4 are all fairly even across the class. However, AO3 definitely looks a lot weaker. Now that's demonstrating knowledge and understanding of theatre. So now that might mean I'm going to add an extra couple of lessons into that. And the great thing is we're doing changes to our curriculum that's all part of our lesson time. We're not doing extra stuff outside of lessons to try and pull grades up. Then the next part of communication is about getting that to the students too. So I'm just going to have a look at Sherlock Holmes' report. So if we click this button, that will download it. And here we've got it open. So you can see here we've got his minimum target grade, he's securing and he's on track. So if I was sitting down with him and his parents to discuss this, it's looking like it's great. However, if we look at the topic summary, we can now highlight, yep, AO3 is an area you need to work on. You're absolutely storming it because of AO1, your ability to develop ideas, you're really creative with the groups. But actually where I want you to focus on in the next term is about the way that you understand drama and looking at some of the theory. So some of that's come out of our home learning. I'm going to set you some extra tasks for home learning, or it might be some things that you do in lesson. We also can see all the marks that we've achieved in the individual assessments that have actually built towards that to give them his term marks. So that's looking at it with a 5-band model. And as I said, we're going to look at a few of these different models. So I'll show you how it's adapted for a 9-band model and some of the challenges that we have with that. So when you have a 9-band attainment model, there's a couple of challenges that we have. When you start looking at what it means in terms of prior attainment and where they should be, some of the, quite commonly, I know a lot of teachers have found this, they can be nervous about reporting grades for those, or GCSE grades for those students, because if a student in year 8 gets a grade 3 in December, what does it actually mean? Does that mean that if they sat the GCSE tomorrow, they would get a grade 3? Or are they saying that they're on track for a grade 3? And this is where it can get really confusing. What I'm not saying is that this is not impossible to overcome. It's just that it's one of those considerations and things that we need to account for when looking at a 9-to-1 model. And I think this is why, well, so if we actually have a look at ways that schools have accounted for this, they may have then introduced extra levels below. And that's because they're going for a flight path progression model. So now looking at how students are making progress, they're using a flight path model. So when students come in with lower Key Stage 2 prior attainment, they might expect them to be on emerging in year 7, working towards in year 8 and grade 1 in year 9. And that's because they know in year 10, they may be at grade 2 and year 11, they might be at grade 3. So we start introducing extra levels here, but you'll also notice that we've got a cap down the bottom where year 7s can't get a grade 9. Because if we're starting to say year 7 students are coming in and getting a grade 9, well, where are they going to be going from there? And realistically, there's very, very few year 11s we're going to have getting a grade 9. So what this model shows, or when schools are using this model, they're using a flight path model. They might have a spreadsheet that kind of shows the different projections, but this can get quite difficult to measure the progress, because when we're looking at whether that student has made progress, we kind of have to look at what their own prior attainment is, what path they're on, what flight path they're on, what point in the year they're at. And there are a few things that this takes, assumes. So for example, here we've got a criteria which is 1 to 9. Now, does this criteria stay the same in each year? So actually, if a student gets grade 1 in year 7, I would expect them to do this in year 8 and this in year 9, in which case they never actually get to these points. If a student comes in at a grade 4 in year 7, then they should move here and here. Or do we have criteria that are different for each year? The second thing is, if you have a look at an age-related model, so this is how it looked before. If we now switch that to a flight path model, the only difference, you're still increasing the progress, you're still increasing the challenge, you're still teaching them in exactly the same way. The only difference is you're now pinning the grades across all years to the same grade. So in year 7, a grade 1 is the same as it is in year 11. So when students are moving up, rather than saying they're getting the same grade, you're saying they have to move in year 7 from, say, a grade 3 up to a grade 4 in year 8, and they have to move to a grade 5. Otherwise, they're not making progress. The problem with this is we know students don't necessarily make linear progress. So some students have a dip in year 7 and then pick up. Other students, or in other subjects, for example, I spoke to a PE teacher today who said it's a real problem when doing this, because they might start in year 8 on rugby, and actually they're fantastic at rugby. So this is a middle attainment student, and they're great at rugby. They play in their county, and then they do tennis. Well, this rugby player is not built for tennis, so suddenly he drops down because he's doing a different topic, different skills. So this now looks like he's doing negative progress, but he's not. So they then start having to force the data to fit and kind of show this constant progress and show they're always going up grade levels. So that's one of the challenges we have with the 9 to 1. Again, it's not unsurmountable, but some of the considerations that we'd need to have are that the grades always need to show progress across Key Stage 3. You might need to cap the grades if you use this model. You have to consider how to handle non-linear progress in different subjects. And also, when you're communicating with parents, do you say that this is an actual grade 4, or are they on track for a grade 4? I'm going to come back to this in a bit after I've shown you the tracker on how we can track this. And the final thing is changing expectation at Key Stage 4. So what can happen is if a student has been told that they are working at grade 6 in year 9, then they'd be here, and then suddenly they do a year 10 and they actually do real GCSE content, real GCSE challenge, and suddenly they drop down to a grade 4. And then you've got that difficult conversation where the kid hasn't done any worse. They have actually been working as hard as they always have, but it's just that our assessments in Key Stage 3 realistically don't match up to Key Stage 4. So the way that we might then have a look at this is in tracking, because again, I say it's not unsurmountable. I'm going to pull up a tracker where we've got a 9 to 1 tracker, and we assess it in the same way. Still got the same assessments, still got the same marks. Our grade boundaries are different. So we now set a different set of grade boundaries. Now, I've done this one based on an age-related grade, but it still shows the same idea. And all we're going to do is match up their minimum target. Now, this minimum target will change year on year. So if we look at this, a year 7 students, their minimum target when their middle prior attainment might be a 2, in year 8, it will be a 3. So all we need to do is just shift the minimum targets here each year. So it's still very doable on these trackers. If you were looking at this and kind of going, do you know what, we have had a lot of problems. There is one really, really simple solution. If you don't want to change the grading types, you'll still have the same sort of 9 bands. There is a way you can do that, which is just simply switch it to an age-related grade. So instead of saying to students, you are at an actual GCSE grade 3 in year 7, you just say, no, you're working towards. If you carry on this way throughout year 7, 8, and 9, you'll be on track to get a grade 3. So that way you can actually give grades 1 to 9 in year 7 and year 8 and year 9, but it's never saying you are actually on a grade 5. It's just by the time we get to GCSE, I'm expecting you're at the level where I'd expect you will get a GCSE grade 5. So that's all very doable. Other age-related grades might be, you know, if you've got four different bands, copper, gold, silver, bronze, and again, we still pitch it up against Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 4. And something that I just want to highlight here about attainment and progress. Sometimes when we look at the grading, because schools are aware, very aware about the challenges with 9 to 1, they might then introduce a progress measure as an attainment band, and whether they're and so we kind of start getting to a bit of a hazy mix between whether it's progress or attainment. So if this is the case, if you're aware that your school is using exceeding the expected standard or meeting, that's fine. However, be aware that a student of middle prior attainment, when we say meeting at the expected standard, are we talking about that for that student and based on their prior attainment, or is it based on the average student? If this is on the average student, then a high prior attainer might get meeting expected standard, but actually they've slipped down. So that's what it can hide. So we've got to be very careful when using progress and only describing progress without linking it to attainment compared to the rest of the cohort or even the expected standard. So this is a point where you might want to take a screenshot. We are going to make this webinar or the presentation available after the webinar. So if you do have, you can actually look through these questions in a little bit more detail to see if you are reviewing your own Key Stage 3, or if you just actually are kind of aware, yeah, we have got some differences in the way subjects approach it, then these are some key questions you can ask yourself and then think about communicating with everybody. So the final thing, as I said, there is absolutely no point in doing assessment at Key Stage 3 unless it impacts on the curriculum. The whole push that we have with pupil progress is that we want to make sure any data we have has an impact on teachers planning lessons the next day. We don't want to have any time wasted in collecting that data, analysing it and having the impact. We want to make sure that that data has an impact on the students. So where I showed you the students' reports, that's why we've got it in there. We want students to take ownership and control and be aware of where it is they can improve their grades. But we also can look at how we can support this at both a subject lead level and a school level. So I'm going to show you this on a slightly different tracker. So I'm going to switch over to Maths, Key Stage 3, and show you first of all their assessments. So similar to what we had in drama, the only difference is we've got different questions. They've done it on actual question level analysis based on an exam paper, but still giving them the same grading. So you can see total polar opposites in the way they assess compared to drama, but is still showing progress and still able to show attainment. Now, if we have a look at the analysis for this group, all of our Key Stage 3 trackers come with subject analysis. So you can now just pull up Maths, Key Stage 3, and have a look at how they've broken down per class. So this first table now shows us how the students are doing in each class compared to their targets. And if we have a look here, we can see straight off X2 is a class that I might want to go and have a little look at. Now, of course, I'm going to triangulate that with any lesson observations, any book looks, any student feedback on the class. But we have got 11 students who are 1 grade away and 6 students who are 2 or more. This is kind of a normal distribution, so we're not so concerned. We may not need to take anything too major here, but this might want a little bit more support. And what's really useful is we can now go back to the tracker, have a look at who are those 11 students. What are the strands? What are the parts of the course they're struggling in? What's the way that's been taught? Are there things that we can do to adapt the teaching to improve those areas? So straight off, this now leads to a much more supportive discussion between the line manager and the teacher of the class. If we have a look at the cumulative total, now this is where I was saying about being able to see where we're going to be going in the future for GCSE. Because securing, we know, according to our progression chart, is going to lead to a grade 5 overall, if we're getting students on securing, then that means we've got 70% of our students that are at securing and above. Now that would suggest that with GCSE, this group will have 70% grade 5 and above. So again, we know whether we've got alarm bells ringing right at the start of year 7, 8, 9, we can make that early intervention, early support in the lessons, so we don't have to wait till key stage 4. We can also compare this to whether that's what we expect compared to the minimum target. So even though this looks great, it's not where we should be compared to our minimum target. So there is still work to be done here. We can also look at the subgroup analysis to see, and we can see actually our lower attainers, we're doing really well. Most of them are actually only 1 grade or below, most are on. But actually for these 1 grade below, that's what we need to work on with our lower attainers. For our higher priority attainers, we've got a lot here who are well off target. So we need to really start increasing the challenge of some of these things, or maybe they're demotivated. We need to find out why. You can also look at it based on pupil premium and other details as well. So that's looking at it from a subject analysis level. And again, as I say, you can always go back to the trackers to investigate that further. And if we come back to the presentation, we also have a grade summary. In fact, I'll show you this live. Now, on my tracker, I've only got 3 or 4 subjects with data in, but you can see this is always live. It's always updated, so I can see all of my subjects and how students are doing across the board. Now, this is far more useful. This is actually one that I've taken from a school who's using our system. This was taken on Tuesday, and I've had a chat with the deputy head on yesterday. And looking at this, it first off tells us a lot of things. Across the board, generally, we got a good spread and distribution of grades. However, if we look here, drama looks like it's excelling. It looks like it's doing fantastic. Now that sounds great. Drama looks like they're doing great. Kids will be loving the fact they're getting these lots of blues in their reports. However, what we can do is we can come back to our descriptors and have a chat with the head of drama and say, well, okay, if they are excelling or mastering in our case, that means you're suggesting they're all going to go on to get grade 9s. Now, is that correct? Or do you think the criteria you've marked them against is a little bit too generous? Do we need to increase the challenge of the assessments? Are our expectations high enough? So that now means we can have a conversation with them to bring them back in line with all other subjects. I'm also experienced that thing where a subject has come out having a lot more reds or having students who are much further under their grades. Now, if we have a look here, this science is in that situation where we've got loads of students who are on emerging and developing. Now, if you have got that, I would go and have a chat with this head of science as well. And again, I would go, well, what this suggests to me is that your students, you're saying that most of your students are going to be below a grade 3 by the time we get to GCSE. Is that correct? No. I think probably what's happened here is the grade boundaries. But again, it leads to a bit more of a conversation about what their understanding is of the term emerging, developing, securing. Now, what I suspect is that this science group have actually approached it in the mindset of this is a flight path, and students should be emerging in year 7, developing in year 8, and securing in year 9. So if they've got that misunderstanding, then that's an issue that we need to address. The whole point that I'm kind of saying, suggesting here is that by making sure that we've got good, clear assessment and that we have consistent approaches to that across all subjects, across the curriculum, then we are in a really good position to support teachers and subject leaders to make sure that they're on the same wavelength as other departments. I also know that it can be if you get departments where you've got lots of blues or students who are doing really well, and other departments who just purely by the way they're assessing and grading look like they're not doing as well. I know actually if I go into this science lesson and this drama lesson, they're both fantastic. They're always getting outstanding. So I know the teaching's not an issue. It's actually just the assessment we just need to tailor and calibrate. So that's where I think it becomes really, really powerful as well. So I think this might be a good point for any questions. Brett, would you like to come in and either sort of give a summary, or is there any questions that you'd like to raise?
Thanks for that, Barney. A couple of questions have come through. One I'd like to kind of pick up on, which is a really interesting point, is one of the attendees was talking about an actual adjustment to that linear path
Mm.
and accounting for students having a progress curve so
Yep.
that it's not linear. But I
Yep.
think, I'd be really interested to get your take on this, Barney, because the reason why I actually responded to basically say it's not necessarily the fact it's linear, it's the fact that it's actually trying to predict a progress path. And the point that Barnaby was making was that actually students progress in different places at different points in the year, depending on the different skills they're also learning, and also that students' ability levels in those particular skills and or knowledge requirements of the course. And, even trying to curve that linear progress is still suggesting there's a fixed path that a student will take. Does that make sense, Barnaby? Have I articulated that well
Yeah,
enough?
I think that's, as I say, this graphic, of course, is, across all students. If we had a big distribution, we would see students doing all sorts of things here. But it becomes quite difficult when you do a flight path model where it assumes that students have to make some sort of linear, whether that's curved linear or slightly wiggly. Either way, it is an ever increasing progress. Whereas the example that I used there was in PE, but I've also had it myself in science, where I'll be teaching them biology, and in year 8 they absolutely love biology. They really can get into it because it's quite simple, whereas physics they really struggle with. Now when we teach physics in term 2 and they've done biology in term 1, then it looks like they've dropped down. Well, they haven't. It's just a harder content, and it's a higher challenge level. So my question to myself as a head of department is then like, well, do I now try and not fix, but kind of do I try and shift it so that actually it looks like they're kind of making progress, even though I know they're not? It's because it's a harder topic. And do I have to kind of fit to this thing that they are always making an increase in progress? Whereas actually, I think when you go down the age-related model, it does make it a lot easier because you're kind of comparing them to the rest of the group and that distribution. So that's why it can be easier. But again, that's not to say that the flight path model is not manageable. It just takes a lot more consideration to get it right and to make sure that everyone's communicating in the same way.
Yeah, and I also agree. Also, as well, that question that's come through is really important to recognize that this might be historically what you see, and therefore you can actually make some assumptions on future progress as a cohort for a particular group. But ultimately, that we need to maybe potentially keep in mind that it's reflections on, previously what's happened rather than a future actual prediction on what should be happening. But we're running this webinar for the specific reason that the context in which has been created is challenging, and effectively there is no right answer, but at the same time there's lots of things that we can definitely consider. So what we don't want to do is position ourselves as saying this is the only way to do it, and this is the way you should be doing it. So they're all we really welcome these questions and challenges on what we're discussing, so that it teases out even more thought and consideration, I think is a good word that Barney used, moving forward. So I really appreciate your question there, Annalie. It's really helpful to discuss these points in much more detail rather than just this is what we're discussing. It's great to pick it apart and actually dive into deeper examples. There was one. Yeah, sorry, Barney. Did you want to add to that?
I can see there was a question earlier on as well about mark schemes and assessments
I
for
was
Key Stage 3.
just about to bring you on to that one. Perfect.
So there are companies out there that do Key Stage 3 curriculum assessments and things that you can use. I mean, it will vary for each subject. The criteria that I showed in there for Head, Heart, Hands PE had just grade descriptors, and then a lot of PE departments just measure against those grade descriptors, so they don't necessarily need to write individual assessments. And the same can be done with particularly with subjects like drama, art, DT, where it's much more about the skill and increasing the skill level, and the same for English as well. Where there's subjects like maths and science, there tends to be a lot more resources, and most people who use our trackers use those resources. And in terms of the grade boundaries, well, the grade boundaries can always be adjusted to give you the right distribution. So on that distribution curve, like we've put in different grade boundaries for different people, so that you actually then get sort of 20% are securing and 40% are developing and so on, so that then matches up.
Fantastic. I think at the moment there is, I mean, I'm actually just kind of not necessarily thinking on my toes here. If anyone has, we've been working with the PE community, the music community as well. We know there's a curriculum called the ISM, that is, well published, and quite a large number of schools use that as a curriculum delivery model and assessment framework. If anyone has any really useful assessment frameworks at Key Stage 3, we would love to be able to share those with the teaching community. We wouldn't be publishing that as our own, nor would we be selling that information. We would literally be crediting whoever was the creator of that resource. That would be published on the PDF and will be free as a download to the teaching community. So if anyone does have a really useful Key Stage 3 curriculum and an assessment framework they'd be willing to share, that we could share with the teaching community for free, please reach out. Please let us know if there's anyone we could connect with. We'd be more than happy to, it'd be really useful to share that, because what that question teases out is they very quickly launched this publication that sent a chain of reaction across the whole of the UK, which was then resulting in a lot of knee-jerk of complete overhaul of their curriculum deliveries, without actually really considering the skill level required to write. You can see just how complex this process is that Barnaby's gone through now. On top of your teaching day and your leadership role within your school, you've now got to write an assessment framework that's taking a lot of consideration and thought from well-researched, really, well-qualified educational specialists that wrote the curriculums in the first place. And there is no support out there. So we'd love to be part of that solution if anyone does have any or can point us in the right direction.
I will actually just highlight, we have got for Key Stage 3, Brett mentioned music ISM. We've also got White Rose Maths as well. We do tracking for that course. So that's a Key Stage 3 one where they've made their maths Key Stage 3 assessments. It's a really good curriculum actually, and worth having a look at if you haven't already. But we got tracking to match that. One last thing I'm going to do, I'm going to share my screen. So the Key Stage 3 trackers that I've been mentioning, if you go to our main site, so www.pupilprogress.com, and there is a free trial that we have, which gives you a 4-week free trial. And you just fill in your details, and you'll be able to choose your courses and your subject area. You'll have access to all the GCSE and A-level trackers and BTEC trackers we have too, but you'll also have Key Stage 3 if you do that trial. And if you are using our platform already, then you can always have a look at some of these. Just add one of your classes or send us a class list to upload. And if you have a look at most subjects, so if I just went into English Key Stage 3, you can add that to one of our pupil progress models down here. So pupil progress mastery, pupil progress 9-1. Those are the two that I've shown you on the webinar here today. And we're also going to be sending out some guides on how to use that. And just if there are any other questions, that again on our site, if you've already got Pupil Progress, you'll have the chat button in Pupil Progress itself, and you can always ask us about the Key Stage 3 trackers here. We've got our support team on board, ready to help out with that too. And if you are on the front end of our site without having logged in, or if you don't have an account with us, then there's also the chat button down here, and we have got a book a Key Stage 3 consultation. So you can do that. It could be whether it's single subject or if it's whole school. Then we're more than happy to for you to book a call, and I will chat through with you the different options.
Very quickly, we had a quick question there from Hayley asking, just to be clear, are you able to actually have a tracker that doesn't have number conversions, and you're able to select from a drop down? Yes, you absolutely are. If you want to, you can just have a tracker that has those level descriptors. I don't know, Barnaby might be scrabbling in the background to bring one up and show us what that looks like, so you can actually see.
Just to sort of echo what Brett was saying there, we do the bespoke tracking. I mean, I've shown you sort of just the two simplest ones that we have, or two ones that we know work particularly well. However, we do also have a criteria type model that can be done. This is as a bespoke for each school. And in this version, you can see here we've got the AOs, but rather than putting in marks, you can actually choose the words to match up with the school's curriculum. and then it will actually give you a grade based on the average of those points as well. So yeah, we can do that way. And to show you a slightly different version, Brett mentioned the music ISM. So we can do more complex things where you can choose what things you want to have showing on there, what different strands you want to assess on, and then for that one, apologies, that's not the one that I want. That was St. Gregory's. So here we go. We got music ISM. So this one has splits up the curriculum into singing, composing, improvising, playing, critical analysis, and things. And then within that, they've done a working towards, working above version where you can put in a 1 to 3, and that will then give you an average score for the lot to then show where they're at. So there are lots of different approaches we can do in the bespoke tracking as well. So I think unless there are any other questions at this point, Brett.
Yeah, that is actually all for the questions. Thank you all for your time. What obviously Barnaby's talking about is really relevant in today's, current climate. There might be a bit of space at the moment, potentially, forgive me, I don't want people screaming at the screen. I know that you've had a really tough time with regard tags and managing, recent COVID outbreaks through schools and bubbles being sent home to isolate, etc. But there may be some room to start looking at potentially what is happening at Key Stage 3 in the next, maybe potentially week or so before you break up, but also at the start of term next year. So feel free to lean on us to sound out any thoughts. Honestly, even if you're not looking to use our system and you did want to have a conversation, we're really passionate about this. It's not just about only interest in our tracking. If you do wanted to just sound out a few ideas at the school that you're teaching at and where you can move to, give us a call. We'll have a chat, no problem. We'd be more than happy to help. Yeah, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.